If most people get an A, what is an A actually saying? My name is Benjamin Isaac, and I'm an editor with Crimson Opinion. This is the first episode of News Talk from Opinion, a new podcast feed from the Crimson Editorial Board, bringing the arguments shaping campus into audio. Today we're talking about grading, and why it's become a proxy war over what students owe their classes, what faculty owe their students, and what a Harvard A is supposed to mean. Over the past few years, there's been a reckoning over campus pedagogy. Faculty and administrators are looking around, wondering what happened to the classrooms they remembered. Last February, an FAS committee released a report which concluded that Harvard students under-prioritized their academics relative to their extracurricular commitments. In October, the Office of Undergraduate Education released a report concluding that the college's grading system is failing to perform the key functions of grading, and that the share of A's, which rose to more than 60% last year, is damaging the academic culture of the college. Early this February, a faculty committee proposed in response a sweeping overhaul of grading that would limit A grades to 20% for every class, with flexibility for up to 4 additional A's per class. The proposal received a warm reaction from faculty members, and a strongly negative response from the student body, but won't go into effect until after approval by a full faculty vote. Grades get to the core of what we do at the university. They get at faculty pride, student ambition, and they're supposed to do something involving learning. To help me untangle what that role is exactly is Allison Farrell. Allison is a senior studying philosophy at the college, and she's a member of the editorial board here at the Crimson. Allison, welcome to the show. To start, a number of these efforts to recenter coursework, to promote intellectual vitality on campus, have at their core the idea that something is broken. Students aren't engaged in coursework. They're not reading enough. They're not learning enough. Something is wrong. Some of this is measurable. Grade inflation has clearly occurred, for example, but a lot of it isn't. In fact, students seem to be reporting spending slightly more time on coursework. What do you make of the Harvard Vibe session? What's the problem on campus?
I think you talk to professors who have been here for a substantial amount of time, and it's clear, students no longer do the optional readings on their syllabi. Students are writing essays that would have merited a B 20 years ago and are receiving A- and A's for them. So I think there is a real problem where students are maybe receiving an inaccurate representation of the quality of their work in their grades, but I also think it's unfair to say students don't care about grades or aren't working hard. So I think this is kind of a set of maybe flawed perceptions that are taken to an extreme, but I do think there's a real problem. I think particularly when it comes to careerism, and maybe sometimes the extent to which extracurriculars are seen as the foundation of Harvard life. There are students who have come to see Harvard less as a chance for a transformative liberal arts education and more as a place just to get the kind of qualification needed to go on to succeed in the big industries of technology, finance, or consulting. I think that's sad, for one, but two, I think it neglects Harvard's purpose as an academic institution. The point of Harvard is to give the kind of education that will lead to a life of flourishing both in one's personal life, but also to teach the kind of thinking skills that are needed for any industry job, any academic job, or really any opportunity one could find oneself facing. That said, I think the problem isn't that students care about their careers. It's about the fact that career motives seem to have taken over some of what Harvard is meant to be about. I think the over-focus on prestige is harmful, but I think Harvard should provide some kind of security in terms of knowing that the Harvard name enables you to pursue the liberal arts and pursue a broad-ranging education without worrying that you're sacrificing your career opportunities. Our unified purpose should be a strong liberal arts education that stands as what unites us as a Harvard community and stands as sort of a turning point around which this transformative experience we're promised turns.
In the report on grade inflation, there were 3 functions of the grade that were laid out. 1, motivating students to engage with their coursework. 2, giving students information about how they're doing in classes. And 3, to distinguish between students for honors prizes and applications to grad school as well as jobs. Which of these functions do you think are defensible?
Well, I think first and foremost, Harvard is an academic institution. Its aim as an institution should be to provide an excellent education to students. And so in our conversation around how we should form our grading system, that should be the question. Do grades serve a useful pedagogical function? And so we can break that down into the three subcategories of functions grades can serve when we're asking how to form our grade system. Should students receive accurate feedback insofar as we're trying to measure how a student is doing in their course? Are they mastering the content? Absolutely. It's a valid aim of grades, and it's one we should pursue. Likewise, when we talk about motivation to engage with coursework, I think this is maybe kind of secondarily important. I think there's an extent to which we're all adults here. Your choice to engage with coursework over something else is your choice. I think it's valid, on the other hand, insofar as we're saying we shouldn't give you better grades so that you can go do more extracurriculars. Motivation to engage with coursework is good insofar as it makes those trade-offs visible, because I know this is something that's very hard to admit as a Harvard student, but we have a finite number of hours and a finite amount of energy. And it's really important that our grading practices aren't trying to keep up the illusion that that's not really the case. When we're thinking about whether or not we should be measuring distinction, I'd say distinction is not a relative measure properly understood if it's going to have a pedagogical aim. A student worthy of distinction isn't one who does better than 5, 10, 20% of her peers. It's a student who does exceptionally well, measured up against a very rigorous standard. And so measuring how well students do relative to one another just doesn't serve a useful pedagogical aim. Whether or not a student can be distinguished from one another for a future employer isn't a relevant aim in the classroom. That might be the relevant aim when you're applying for jobs, but that's not what Harvard's mission should be. We're an educational institution, right? And so we should be giving students accurate feedback that will, when we're measuring students up against a rigorous standard, result in a distinction between the top performers and those in the middle and at the bottom. But that can't be how we design our system. It has to be a result of an otherwise accurate, fair, and reasonable grading system.
So I take your point is that distinction is something that should be achieved by a good grading system, but it isn't necessarily a thing that we should be designing a grading system around.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we were to have a perfect grading system, how many students do you think would get A's? Or what proportion of Harvard students do you think would get A's?
The right outcome of a grading system is one that comes from a grading system that measures the right things in the right ways. And so what percent would achieve A's? I quite frankly can't tell you. I can't put a good number on it. Now, I have a suspicion that the number of A's right now being handed out is far above what a proper grading system should be handing out. But that's just a suspicion. That's why I'm worried about setting any one number where we should cap it.
I share the view that the number of A's that are earned is probably less than the number of A's than we have right now. 60% in particular seems to be far too high to me. But then what do you make of the faculty committee proposal to cap A's at 20%? I think it's directionally correct because I think that the number of A's being earned right now is vastly out of proportion with the number of A's that are deserved.
While I agree with you, it's directionally correct. The problem is we don't know if we're going too far in that direction, right? So I can't tell you if 20% is overshooting the number of A's we should expect to see or undershooting, which is why it's really dangerous to set a number here. I think we can also look at schools that don't have this systemic problem with grade inflation and take them as inspiration. For example, the University of Chicago, right? Obviously, we may not want to become the place where fun goes to die, but we do want to take inspiration from schools that don't see rampant grade inflation and see what are they doing differently, because not all of these schools have grade caps. So I think there's ways of addressing this problem that avoid reverse engineering from 20% back to the grading system we want. A 20% cap doesn't force a course to be more intellectually rigorous. It doesn't force them to grade more harshly even. What it forces them to do is take the top number scores, find out where the 20th percentile is, add 4 students onto it, and say, well, those students get A's. I think there might be something true about the positive cultural benefits of reducing the number of A's, because right now, I think every Harvard student is a bit of a perfectionist. I'm no exception. But I think making it so that getting A- is normal, making it so that a B+ isn't seen as a failing grade. As an aside, it used to be a gentleman's C. I think it's now a gentleman's B+ or B. So even the lower end,
A- these days.
Yeah, even the low end is inflated. And that's ridiculous, quite frankly. But I'm worried that we're going to end up creating positive cultural change, creating more rigorous courses by harming students in the short run. And I think this is the problem with this proposal.
Do you really think it's to harm students to give them an A- instead of an A?
look, harm used in maybe a very philosophical sense here, right? It's a harm in that they may not deserve the A-, and then we're giving them one anyway, right? I hope it's not the case that receiving A- is a source of deep psychological harm. I hope, likewise, that handing out more A- and lower grades is not going to result in a culture of intense, horrible competition. If what I've said is right, that we can't actually know what a just grading distribution would look like without having a just grading system, if we're giving students grades based on a grade cap system, those grades will fail to accurately reflect useful pieces of feedback to students. And they're not going to be necessarily useful for making students engage more in their coursework as much as worry about the difference between a 95 and a 96 or a 92 and a 93. And that's not a culture we want, right? When learning becomes about grades, we lose out on what's great about learning, which is the actual intellectual depth of content. When it becomes about points, we've already taken the wrong tack. And if a student who deserves an A is getting an A-, then that's not a useful piece of feedback.
Are you worried that grade deflation will disincentivize intellectual exploration?
Not at all. I actually think that grade deflation will incentivize it, right? I'm currently incredibly incentivized to stay within my comfort zone because having an A-, a B+, a B is an aberration on a transcript if you're in some disciplines. That's disincentivizing exploration. Because if a B is a bad grade, then you can only take classes where you know you'll get an A. If an A- is a bad grade, as clearly some students think it is, then you'll only take classes where you know you'll get an A. And I think this is really the root of the problem. Exploration is only encouraged when it's okay to fail. I think there should be, on most transcripts, at least a B. And I think that's a sign of a healthy, well-rounded student because we can't possibly be all equally good at everything. None of us are excellent in every field or at every challenge we take on, and we're all at different points in our journeys with learning.
Proponents of the proposal have made an argument that grade inflation is a collective action problem, that individual professors and departments, they don't have the incentive to act because students will give them tons of flack, they'll flee their classes, they'll flee their departments. And so what they really need is unified action by administration in order to bind their hands, in a sense, so that they can then implement these sort of pedagogical changes that we're talking about. Early faculty support seems to me to be a strong signal that this is the case. Do you think that's right? I mean, don't you think that the cap would allow faculty to implement the sort of measures that we want to see?
So let me just say, first off, that I think your diagnosis of the problem is completely right. This is a collective action problem. No one professor can necessarily afford to jeopardize their course enrollments just for the sake of grading to what they think is a more fair standard. Likewise, I think that if any one department takes drastic action to raise their grading standards, it's going to have a negative impact on the outcomes they see in course enrollment, in the number of concentrators, and so on. Now, obviously, some departments grade more harshly than others right now. There are individual actors who are still taking action, right? That said, I think it is a collective action problem. We need to address it as such. Does that mean we need an absolute grade cap? No. I think what it means is that we need to find ways that are still top-down, still across the board, but maybe aren't as absolute in terms of the number of students who get A's, that instead focus on professors holding one another accountable. Obviously, I'm not an administrator, I'm not a professor, but something I imagine like an auditing system where if we see a professor giving out 40% A's in a course, especially year after year, there should be a conversation. I think professors who give out an exceptional number of A's should have to justify that because I agree it's a problem. But if a professor can justify it, they should be allowed to do it. The problem isn't giving out too many A's, it's giving out unjustified A's. So I think having more stringent requirements for how we justify the high grades we're giving or high grades we're being given is really where the best solution to the problem lies.
But don't you think that that would leave the basic incentive system that professors face unchanged? That they will get student pushback if they don't give out enough A's, that they will get students fleeing their classes or departments if they're particularly strict? Aren't we just relocating the unit of the collective action problem slightly upward by locating it within departments as opposed to across the university?
Well, I think it should be happening at every level, right? So if a department is well known for giving out way too many A's, that should be a conversation that its dean is having with it, right? We have divisional deans for this reason, and we have, a dean of the college, a dean of undergraduate education for this purpose. But what I think is vital here is that it's a collective action problem because everyone knows that if I act alone, I'll be the one penalized. If we're able to make sure that there are supports at every level, then that collective action problem goes away.
On the other hand, students seem to be concerned that the proposal will perpetuate inequities on campus. Do you think they're right to be concerned?
I think that worries about too much competition are very valid. I also think worries about a higher incentive to cheat are very troublesome. The students at the top of their classes should be the ones that are collaborating the most. We want to reward collaboration, not penalize it. Mental health-wise, likewise, I think this is a problem that can be addressed with nuance and compassion. If we're going to accept that argument, though, that's an argument against any more rigorous grading. And that means we have to be very careful about how we deal with the cultural impact of any change to grades. I don't think it's an argument against this specific proposal because, again, like I've said, there is a problem with grade inflation and we do need to address it. And the solution vis-a-vis mental health cannot be just continuing with grade inflation. Now, I think my bigger worry in some ways than competition is the incentive to cheat, right? If we institute a 20% grade cap, then think about what you've just done for anyone who's not sure on what side of that 80th percentile they're going to land. If they are going to be in the top 20% of their class, then they have a huge incentive to cheat because if they happen to land a couple people lower, they don't get the A. If they happen to land a couple people higher, great. Now, again, I don't think that our grading system needs to be designed around concerns of cheating, but I think it's a substantial concern that a cap raises.
I'm a little skeptical and I want to push back. So, first of all, as far as I can tell, 60% of Harvard courses are already in compliance with the proposed 20% cap, which is to say that this really is only applying to a minority of courses on campus. Secondly, I think that collaboration is so positive sum among students that the odds that collaborating with a friend of yours is going to cause them to go over you in the distribution seems relatively small relative to the probability that you'll both do better within the distribution, such that I feel like students aren't going to change their incentives all that much. And third, something I'd like to hear your take on is, isn't an incentive to cheat just an improperty of any rigorous grading distribution? It's not a feature of one that is capped so much as one that is difficult. In any system where we grade people harshly and that it's really hard to get an A, there's going to be an incentive to cheat. And the only way to reduce the incentive to cheat is just to guarantee more people A's, right?
So I think a cap is uniquely conducive to cheating because it makes students think not, oh, am I doing well in this class, but am I doing precisely well enough? When the difference between an A and an A minus in a course that currently is seeing a fairly narrow distribution of grades is just a couple points, then every single point matters. Versus in a rigorous grading system, the gap between an A and an A minus isn't a single point. It's a little bit broader. I think even if this is only impacting 40% of courses, and 40% is a big number, mind you, the problem is that in 40% of cases, we're still going to see the problems with competition and cheating we've named. Also, this is why I focused more on why or not this is a good pedagogical move, because I don't think the problem is that this will lead to definitely widespread competition and definitely widespread cheating. I think what's definitely true is that this is not the best way of establishing a pedagogically sound grading system. So that's why I'm not as concerned about whether or not 60% or 70% are affected or unaffected. On collaboration, I agree that collaboration is positive sum, but the problem is, again, we don't really know what impact this will have on our culture. Even if it's actually the case, I think I'd like to point out, too, that collaborating with your friend or a few friends is unlikely to impact your grade. I don't know if that's how this will be perceived psychologically. I think if we move away from this, viewing students as rational agents, instead view students as people deeply embedded in this culture of success and being driven, I'm less certain that you're right, that it will not lead to an impact.
So then, if a cap isn't the right way to solve the problem, what is?
We need to have something that is centralized. Now, top-down may be the wrong word, actually, but we need to ensure that there's some accountability for giving out grades that far exceed what any reasonable distribution would look like. I also think, maybe more importantly, how do we address this problem without relying on setting expectations for a number of grades and then going back and reforming our practices? Because we can't know what the right distribution of grades is without having the right grading system. So using an outcomes-based approach to engineer our grading practices is just getting things backwards. I've spoken with professors who tell me, students don't even do the optional readings at all, even if they're interested anymore. Students don't have any incentive to look at things that are beyond the minimum required because either They don't think it's relevant to earning a grade that demonstrates true mastery, or they're too busy with other things. And obviously, we can only do so much with the latter. But with the former, we can actually say, no, what it means to earn an A in a class isn't that you did the bare minimum readings, you did the bare minimum on the essays, problem sets, tests, what have you. It's no, you went and dug into those optional readings on the syllabus. You came to office hours and asked questions. You went above and beyond. You went to that next level. And that's what our grades should measure at that high end. It's about developing a rigorous, mastery-based system of grading.
I think part of the problem is that students feel like they've come to Harvard with this implicit bargain that they've already gotten in, and that was the hardest part. And now all that they're going to get is A's from here on out, and it's easy coasting. And I think we've seen that from the student reaction to the proposal to cap the number of A's, which was outrage, open letters, change.org petitions.
To students who say they're being treated unfairly, I'd say you and all of your peers are receiving the same treatment. That's fairness. In some ways, I'd actually argue that at least pursuing some policy of grade deflation, not the grade cap system, which I still think has serious flaws, is more fair. Because what we need to ensure is some uniformity in grading across departments, across disciplines. Now, that doesn't mean the same percentage of students getting the same grades in any given class. What it means is that the level of mastery expected for an A, A minus, and go down the grading scale from there is the same. So I think in terms of fairness, I'd say that the current system is actually far more unfair or unjust. Likewise, saying that being denied grades that have been promised to you, right? I think this looks at grading the wrong way around. If Harvard is simply meant to give you A's for coming in and doing the bare minimum, then I think that says something very shallow about Harvard's purpose. Harvard education should be, as we're constantly promised, transformative. But no experience is transformative unless it's difficult in some way. And so I think actually this is a way of making good on Harvard's promise to us to provide a transformative liberal arts education that requires deep intellectual engagement, deep academic work, and a deep dedication to learning how to push through difficulty.
When I think about fairness, I think that grade inflation is primarily unfair to students who need a signal that they haven't gotten there on a particular class, that they don't know a concept as well as they might think that they do. And when we inflate their grades, we're not giving them that signal that they need to improve, that they need to get feedback, that they need to learn how to do better. And then we send them off into the world, and all of a sudden, maybe they don't get the opportunities that they're looking for, maybe they don't do as well in the professional world because they didn't get the feedback when they needed it.
Precisely. Now, I think it's also a matter of fairness to give students the feedback that will actually benefit them. And good feedback has to actually give you some information about how you're doing. I don't think that has to be relative to your peers, but it does have to be relative to a high standard of mastery. It's also not giving you a useful sense of accomplishment, and I think that's the other thing that people are really lacking right now. If you look at a transcript full of A's and your only feeling is relief, then you're missing out on what should be the reward of having put in effort, which is someone saying, look, you tried really hard to do well in this class. You did put in the effort. You actually succeeded, and you get an A. That's a reward. Students deserve to feel proud of themselves, but you can't feel pride in your work. At least you can't feel pride in the outcome of your work if you know that the outcome, or you expect at least the outcome is going to be an A. That has to be something you earn and work towards.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. And with that, Allison, thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome.